What we're looking at here is a picnic table at a wooden shelter along the Appalachian Trail, and the top of this table has been burned by a camp stove that leaked burning fuel. In fact, at this particular spot, it looks like that kind of incident took place 3 times. Based on what I have seen, this kind of thing happens with some frequency. I have seen a number of picnic tables on the AT that have burnt spots like this. And also, based on everything I know about camp stoves, these burns were almost certainly caused by stoves that use white gas, which is often sold in the form of Coleman fuel. And this particular table is a real Hall of Famer. I counted 9 spots where a burning stove charred the wood of this tabletop. I think it's fair to assume no one is going to do this kind of thing on purpose. We can also ask if operator error is responsible for some of these accidents, and it very well could be. Later, we'll discuss a couple of ways that might happen. But it's also true, on the other hand, if other hikers are like me, they'll tend to use the same stove year after year after year after year until finally it gives up the ghost, usually when we're out in the woods. And because many white gas stoves have fittings that are screwed together and things like rubber O-ring seals over long periods of time, that increases the odds that one of those elements are going to break down. I was not too far away at one shelter when a man and a woman were trying to light their stove on a picnic table. The thing started shooting burning fuel out one side of it. There was some shrieking and jumping backward. And it was obvious that the man and the woman would have much preferred the stove work without trying to set the table on fire. Now the AT, of course, is a long trail. When people try to hike huge distances on the trail, they're going to be on it for weeks and weeks at a time. If they're using a gas stove, they will be using that gas stove every day. That's going to be a lot of use, and that's going to increase the odds that they might experience a stove malfunction of some sort. The same gas stove that might malfunction on the AT otherwise could be perfectly reliable if it was used only infrequently, for example on weekend trips. So we're going to talk about what might be done to avoid these kinds of problems, and we're also going to talk about other stove alternatives that are very reliable, very practical, and will serve a hiker well on the Appalachian Trail. I have seen 2 basic kinds of white gas stoves used on the Appalachian Trail. One type resembles this one. It has a gas tank underneath the burner. The second type is an Msr stove. Every Msr stove I've seen on the AT has been a whisper light, and that's what this one is. And the Msr company has gone to some lengths to provide to the user the kind of information and tools needed to keep the stove running in good order for long periods of time. And we'll talk about that in detail a little later. Many of the stoves of this type are made by the Coleman company, and I have owned 2 Coleman stoves like this. What we're looking at here is a old fuzzy picture of the first one I had. I used it a lot for about 10 years. The short story is it eventually broke, and attempts to repair it failed. I replaced it with this one, which I have had no problem with. Some manufacturers of these type stoves warn against overfilling the fuel tank, which I assume means filling it up as far as the fuel cap. If that kind of overfilling would interfere with the process that vaporizes the fuel in the stove, we might end up with a burn mark on a picnic table that looks like this. Another potential problem would be if we disregard the stove's operating instructions. Let's use this stove as an example of how that might happen. The user is directed to pump up the stove 25 times, hold a lighted match to the burner, and then open the fuel valve to a high setting. Once the stove is lit, the user is then directed to pump the stove an additional 30 times. What would happen instead if we first pumped the stove up 50 times and then lit it with the fuel valve on a high setting? That would be an amount of fuel far in excess of what is needed to light the stove. The thing would flame up badly. It's possible burning fuel could spill out and land on a picnic table. Virtually any type of white gas stove can experience clogging, and this often happens at what is called the jet, which is a small nozzle that sends fuel directly into the burner. I have read that the jet on a Coleman stove like this can be cleared by moving the fuel control from the closed position to the fully open position several times, while of course the stove is not burning. Unlike the Coleman stove, the Msr has to be preheated. Once the fuel is pressurized, you are directed to open the valve just enough to fill the cup below the burner with a little bit of fuel, then you close the valve. The next step is to light that fuel in the cup to preheat the stove. As the flame begins to die down, you can reopen the valve and the stove should burn blue. Potential problems with an MSR stove are going to center on one of three things. One would be the jet, the other one would be the fuel line that connects the tank to the stove, and the other one would be the pump that pressurizes the fuel tank. MSR has two videos on YouTube. One describes how to maintain the stove itself. The other one describes how to maintain the pump. When it comes to the jet and the fuel line, the most common problem would be clogging. If you shake one of these stoves up and down, you'll hear something rattling inside. What that rattling is, it's a small weight with a small wire on one end. When you shake the stove up and down, it will send that wire into the jet opening and help keep it clear. As it is sold, the stove carries the material that is needed to clean the jet and the fuel line. If there is a clogging issue, the fuel will tend to move very slowly through the stove. And I can tell you what might happen if you light the stove under those conditions, because I did it once. When I lit my stove to preheat it, there was very little fuel in that cup and I got a very small flame. At first I thought I didn't open the valve far enough, so I opened the valve all the way, and that was my mistake, because a couple of seconds later a clog that was apparently in the jet cleared itself and then the fuel poured through the stove full blast. Well, that was a surprise, and I have recreated that scenario so you can see exactly what it looked like. So this is an example of an operator error. Lighting the stove was a mistake under these circumstances. What I should have done instead was grab my tools and find out why I wasn't getting a decent fuel flow. Making some kind of mistake when preheating a white gas stove could easily scorch the top of a picnic table. Now the pump is made of plastic and it can break, and I broke the original pump that came with this stove. The stove would not work until I got a replacement. So if you take one on the Appalachian Trail, my advice is take care not to break the pump. If you are determined to use a white gas stove on the Appalachian Trail, I hope these tips help. On the other hand, if you're not quite that determined, I can tell you that I've used other types of stoves extensively, and those stoves have given me no trouble whatsoever. And one type of stove that I'm talking about is the canister stove that uses a mix of butane and propane. These stoves are very simple. They have few moving parts. No preheating is required. There's very little chance a butane-propane mix will cause clogging, which is common with liquid fuels that typically have additives. The stove on the left is called a Micro Bluet, and the one on the right is called a Snow Peak. They both have very solid seals. The Snow Peak has a small O-ring that is backed up by a large overbuilt flat gasket. Every canister stove I've ever seen will screw into the fuel tank, and that helps assure a very tight seal. There are a number of other types of canister stoves that are almost certainly just as reliable as these two. Probably the biggest disadvantage with stoves of this type are the steel canisters themselves. A lot of people won't like the idea of throwing away steel like this. In the description I put a link on how to recycle these canisters if by some chance you can come across a recycling bin somewhere near the AT. I have also used Esbit tablets repeatedly on the Appalachian Trail. They are a very weight-efficient approach. I used a wing stove that weighed an ounce. These days you can buy a titanium wing stove that weighs 4/10 of an ounce. I cut the windscreen from a heavy aluminum foil cookie sheet I got at a supermarket, and it works just fine. This also can be used with a canister stove or an MSR stove for that matter. The biggest disadvantage of an Esbit stove is it will make the bottom of the pot dirty, something similar to cooking over an open fire. I found it was fairly easy to keep the bottom of my pot reasonably clean by just rubbing it on the ground after I got done with it. I carried the pot in a stuff sack so it didn't get anything dirty inside my pack. For many good reasons, alcohol stoves are also a very popular option on the Appalachian Trail. In order to do the topic justice, I'm going to discuss alcohol stoves in a separate video. That's all, folks. We are done. And as always, thank you very much for watching.